This is lecture 13 for Psych4981. This is the last lecture for this course in the history of psychology. So this particular lecture is going to cover a bunch of loose ends. I want to finish up by taking some time to deal with the crisis that I brought up in the last lecture, the crisis of reproducibility in psychology, and talk about how we can find our way out of that crisis. I want to then move to talk a little bit more about gender in psychology, which has been a recurrent theme throughout the semester, but we have a couple more people I want to talk about there. We'll talk a little bit about ethnicity in psychology, the organizations of psychology, and then the final thing we'll do is we'll go back and look at our quiz that I gave you at the very first lecture. Well, where I was last time was we were talking about these problems in psychology where people aren't able to reproduce other people's findings. And we had that large paper that was published in Science from the Open Science collaboration, where they looked at 100 studies to try to replicate them. Well, the fact is we actually don't see many replications published in psychology, despite what you might think would be a kind of a common practice that we would go about trying to replicate each other's work and then show things that have been well replicated. We don't tend to publish these replications, so you don't tend to find them very much. Everett and Earp in 2015 talked about this a bit, and they wanted to know, look at some of the reasons why we don't see more replication in psychology. They argued that one of the reasons is, independent direct replications of others' findings can be time-consuming for the replicating researcher. That is, if you're going to take the time to go ahead and go through someone else's findings and to replicate them, then you're not doing anything new. And if you're not doing anything new, then you won't be rewarded with the latest grants or whatever it happens to be. So they can be time consuming, and maybe frankly, people don't want to do this. The replications are likely to take energy and resources directly away from other projects that reflect one's own original thinking. Number 3, replications are generally hard to publish, in large part because they're viewed as being unoriginal. So whether you find the same thing as the original paper did, or you find a different pattern of results, doesn't really matter. The replication itself, because you're not doing something brand new, is looked at by some journals in psychology as not being original, and therefore it won't be accepted for publication. Even if the replications are published, they're likely to be seen as bricklaying exercises rather than as major contributions to the field. 5, replications bring less recognition and reward, and even basic career security to their authors. So it almost looks like a fool's errand for someone to spend time replicating other people's research. It's not going to help you with your promotions. It's not going to help you get with a job. So really, we're kind of sending a message to people, don't bother with these replications. So for these reasons, the authors, Everett and Earp, advocate that psychology is facing a disciplinary social dilemma, where the interests of the discipline is at odds with the interest of the individual researcher. So it might be good for us as a discipline to have lots of replications to help us see what findings are consistent and reliable and can be found over different time periods. But that will not help the individual researcher and his or her career. And so that's why Everett and Earp think that this is not happening very much, and it's not happening enough really in psychology. So what could we do? What can we try to, improve our field? And that's where a lot of the hand-wringing about the crisis in psychology has gone to, is now moving more to a solutions-based approach. So there are some solutions that I can talk about here that are for the individual researcher, things that one can do if they are interested in doing a better job of making sure their research is going to be solid and could be reproduced. Probably the first thing everybody's now advocating is to increase your sample size. So try to have at the very least, 60 to 75 participants per condition, no matter what your kind of research is, no matter whether you're doing developmental and it's hard to get babies, whether you're working with atypical populations that have a special condition, whatever it is, you try to get 60 to 75 participants per condition in each group, because then you'll have enough power, possibly, to start looking at some of these effects. You want to also report all of your measures, your conditions, and your procedures that are used in the study. You don't want to be cherry picking the best results. You don't want to be hiding measures that that didn't work out. You want to let your reader know everything that you've done. And if this means that you have to publish it in an appendix, that's fine. But you also could possibly add this statement to your article, where you could say, we report how we determined our sample size, all data exclusions, if any, all manipulations, and all measures in the study. So by putting this statement in your paper, you're affirming the idea that you are being as transparent as possible, that you're not hiding anything. Sure, someone could lie and put this statement in their article, but the point is, good science, a person who's actually trying to do best practices, would put this in there and also follow what they're saying. Also, don't use any post hoc explanations as original predictions. So this is the idea that we should try to avoid harking. Okay, so don't do any harking, don't hypothesis test after the results are known. Finally, a really common thing that's happening now is that people are pre-registering their studies before they collect their data, or at least before they analyze it. So here what you do is you go to a place like openscience.io or openscienceframework.org or wherever it is. You can find this many different places. And what you do is you write down exactly what it is that you're going to do, what you're hypothesizing, what you're predicting, and then you lock it away. You basically time, date, stamp it. You could publicly present it then, but more often most people are just going ahead and keeping that information hidden so they don't go ahead and tip off others to what they're doing yet. But then after you've collected your data and you're starting to analyze it, we now have a time, date stamp of what you originally were predicting. And as long as your analyses are going to happen after this time, date stamp of when you made these predictions, no one could accuse you of trying to hide null findings, trying to do harking or whatever it is. So pre-registration is becoming a standard. And I'm happy to say that in the School of Psychology at the University of Queensland, it's becoming very widespread. In just a matter of a couple of years, we've had a huge uptake in the number of students doing this, as well as other kinds of studies going on in the school. Other solutions can happen more at the journal or field level. So these are things that we could be doing as a discipline more. And so one of those things we could be doing is welcoming pre-registered studies, particularly those that are aimed to replicate prior research. So journals could give special attention or give special sections to papers that have been pre-registered, and therefore give us more reasons to want to do them. You could require that the authors report all the measures, conditions, and procedures used in the study. So in the instructions at that journal, they could say that anybody who submits a paper is therefore complying with our requirement that you are reporting all your measures, conditions, and procedures. That the journal or your field encourages both exploratory and confirmatory research. So that is, confirmatory research is basically where you pre-registered hypotheses to say, this is why I'm doing this research. I'm testing this hypothesis and I want to see if I can confirm it. But let's say you have lots of really interesting data, a bunch of variables that you collected, and you're not really quite sure what you're going to want to predict. You just want to explore it and look for some descriptive information about it. That's fine. What you could do then is just say that this is an exploratory paper, or these sets of analyses are for exploratory purposes, and differentiate that from what's the confirmatory part of your research. So we're saying that both parts are important. It's just don't present exploratory research as if it was confirmatory by then adding hypotheses to the introduction to justify the findings that you have in your exploratory research. Okay, so it's welcoming exploratory research and confirmatory research. And then finally, what we're doing here is we want to educate our students about best practices, because it might be a lot harder for our more senior colleagues to want to change their ways. But if we get new people coming into the field, we should get a quick uptake. And I think this is actually happening. I'm very, very impressed in the last few years of what's been happening in open science. That's mainly coming from people who are brand new, who are doing their PhDs right now. Some of them are honor students. Some of them are just starting a postdoc. And people are very well embracing these best practices about open science. You could also just improve your own statistical inferences. And this is an example of an online course that you could take called Improving Your Statistical Inferences by this guy here, Daniel Lakens. And you can see here he says, in this course, I try to teach all the stuff I wished I had learned when I was a student. It includes the basics, how to interpret p-values, what likelihoods and Bayesian statistics are, how to control error rates or calculate effect sizes, to what I think should also be the basics: equivalence testing, the positive predictive value, sequential analyses, P-curve analysis, open science. And so he's just on the side here. You don't have to actually formally get this from your own course. You could just go and learn about this yourself and become better educated about it. But again, I think that even in our School of Psychology, we're doing a better and better job of teaching our students about these new methods so that we can start to rectify the problems that we've had in our discipline. Other things you could do as a student to become more aware and to learn more about what's going on is to listen to podcasts. One of the podcasts that I highly recommend is this one here by Sanjay Srivastava, Alexa Tullett, and Samin Vazir, who are all leaders in the open science movement. And their podcast is called The Black Goat and comes out a couple times a month. And they discuss a lot of these issues and also talk a lot about some of the issues that are facing early career scientists in psychology. Other podcasts I could recommend that also cover a lot of these same topics are things like Two Psychologists and Four Beers, Reproducibility, which was originally started by some postgraduate students, and Everything Hurts by Dan Quintana and James Heathers. And James Heathers is an Australian, and you could listen to what an Australian has to say about all this as well. So we have lots of podcasts that are out there and are great ways for you in a fun way learn more about what's going on in resolving this crisis that we have in psychology. And if you really want to get into it, you could consider joining this society called the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science. It's been around now about 4 or 5 years. And you can see it's called SIPS, and they have an annual conference. The conferences that they have had, I've been to a couple of them now. They're very intense, and they're really focused on work, trying to come up with new methods, new ways that we should be doing things. How could we educate more people? What's the best way to resolve this particular QRP that researchers are engaged in? And so they have these workshops and these hackathons and activities that when you go there, you're not just sitting there passively listening to someone speak, you're actually contributing to the development of better methods in psychology. And this is what you can kind of see from this snapshot of this program. So I'm optimistic that we're coming out of this crisis because people are coming up with new approaches that I think will improve our psychology. And maybe then in 10 or 15 years, a history of psychology class like this would talk about how we got through this crisis and what happened on the other side. All right, I'm going to turn to the next topic for this lecture. And those of you who are listening to this lecture who are not enrolled in PSYC4981 won't know that we have a required book this semester called Delusions of Gender, which the students in the class have read, and they've written an essay about. And I will not cover that very much here because the students who have taken the course have already read the book and know a lot about what Cordelia Fine has to say. I wanted to highlight a couple things, though, about this. So first of all, the book itself is really good. It was written in 2010, and it talks about, you can see the real science behind sex differences. And then more recently, in 2017, she released another book, published another book called Testosterone Rex, Myths of Sex, Science, and Society, which follows up on a lot of the ideas that she talks about in the 2010 book. And so I want you to know that those are out there. And in addition, I thought you'd like to also kind of see something more about what's going on with Cordelia Fine. So you can see this little blurb. This is actually a little film clip, a little clip that she made to promote Testosterone Rex, and you'll get to hear her talk about some of the issues that she covers in these books.
What do you think when you hear people calling for gender quotas for senior leadership positions in business and government? What's your reaction when you come across parents campaigning against the marketing of separate boy toys and girl toys? What's your response to efforts to even out the numbers of men and women in science, technology, engineering, and mathematical careers? A common concern is that these egalitarian aspirations are misguided. What if men just naturally prefer higher status, riskier jobs? What if boys and girls just naturally prefer to play with different kinds of toys and grow up to be interested in different kinds of occupations? After all, haven't males and females evolved to be different? What about all that male testosterone? Shouldn't we just accept that our brains and natures have been differently shaped by evolutionary pressures in our ancestral past? I'm Cordelia Fine, the author of Testosterone Rex, Unmaking the Myths of Our Gendered Minds, and this is the Testosterone Rex view, that familiar, pervasive and powerful story of sex and society. Weaving together interlinked claims about evolution, brains, hormones and behaviour, it offers a neat and compelling account of our society's persistent and seemingly intractable sex inequalities. Denying Testosterone Rex can seem tantamount to denying biology and evolution. But dig a little deeper into the science, and you'll find that rejecting the Testosterone Rex view doesn't require denial of evolution, of biology, or difference at all. In the evolution of the science of sex, which has seen important advances in evolutionary biology, neuro and behavioural science, endocrinology and philosophy of biology, Testosterone Rex has become extinct. It misrepresents our past, present and future. It misdirects scientific research and it reinforces an unequal status quo. It's time to say goodbye and move on.
So that leads us to our next section of today's lecture, which is that I wanted to talk about psychology today, to kind of give us a snapshot of where psychology is. And in order to do that, one of the things I need to address directly is this first point. The fact that in this course, you've seen how little I've spoken about women and ethnic minorities in the history of psychology. And you've also seen that it's had largely a Western focus. So I want to talk about that in a little bit more detail. It's definitely an issue that I'm aware of about looking at the history of psychology, that it looks like it's the history of white men, and there's been occasionally a woman here and there who popped up, and certainly we didn't cover anybody outside of this North American tradition. The European North American tradition. Let's talk a little bit about that, and then we'll get into these other topics as well. Before we move on to talk about some of these bigger issues, I wanted to introduce one more psychologist to you, one more person for this course, and that is Eleanor Maccoby, who died in 2018 at the age of 101. She was a really fascinating person. She attended Reed College in Oregon as an undergraduate and completed her PhD in experimental psychology at the University of Michigan in 1950. She then went on to Harvard and was there for several years as a postdoc, and she developed a collaboration there with a developmental psychologist named Robert Sears. While she was there at Harvard, she even worked in Skinner's lab at a time. In 1958, Robert Sears had moved to Stanford University, and when he got there, he went ahead and offered Eleanor Maccoby to also come and join the department. So she and her husband came there in 1958, and she stayed there until the end of her career. She was later the chair of the department from 1973 to 1976. Now, this is at a time that even at Stanford, women in the faculty made up less than 5% of all of the tenure track professors and only 2% of the full professors. So she was quite remarkable, even in the 70s, as not being a place where a lot of women had very high profile positions. As she progressed in her career, she was honored with many awards that had to do with her work in developmental psychology and the study of gender differences. Even today, there's the Division 7 of the American Psychological Association. They have this thing they call the Maccoby Award that's given to the author of a book making contributions to developmental psychology. So the best book of the year on developmental psychology can get the Maccoby Award. Why I bring her up is because she's a pretty fascinating person who kind of helps us bridge some of the time period that we've covered in the last 100 years in this course with the present, and specifically to look at a case example of a woman who was hired into a psychology professor in the relatively modern era and some of the issues that she faced. It turns out that she was interviewed in 2011 at Stanford for an oral history project that they've done for a lot of their professors who've retired. And if you want to, you can look for this at the URL that you see here. Stanford Library has the full, I would say it's probably an hour and a half interview, and the total transcript is also there as well. So I want to go ahead and show you this interview, and I'm going to play excerpts of it, that is. I'm going to go ahead and let you hear her speaking, and I'll show you the transcript at the same time of some different sections. So the first thing I want to do is show you the part of her interview where she talks about how she ended up at Stanford in the first place.
All right, today is Wednesday, February 16th, 2011, and I am the interviewer, Marion Lewenstein, and I am interviewing Eleanor Maccoby. Eleanor, are you here?
Here I am, yes. Hello, Marion.
Because you gave one of the talks at the Emeriti session, and you so succinctly put together the history of your movement through psychological research, I think rather than starting with your personal history of your academic career, we will start with your Stanford experiences. So I know that you came to Stanford in either 1957 or 1958, and I'd like you to talk about how you came to be at Stanford and how you found your department. That's what's lacking from our history of you. How you found the department and how you moved through the department. So would you like to start there?
Bob Sears brought me to Stanford, and he and I had been working together at Harvard in the Laboratory of Human Development there. When he came to take the chairmanship at Stanford, he established an organization, a Laboratory of Human Development here at Stanford, and raised some money for it. And he wanted me to be part of that and also to join the psychology department and teach there. Excuse me. We had jointly written the Patterns of Child Rearing book, which had been very well received. And so he knew something about my research style, what I could do and what my limitations were.
When did you write that book together?
After he moved here, we did the writing. We did all the collection of data in the early 50s at Harvard. That is, our people that we were interviewing and whose children we were measuring were in nearby Newton and Watertown. So that was, by those days' standards, a very large-scale study. We had 400 families. Nowadays, people have thousands, of course. And we also introduced ourselves to what was then the state-of-the-art use of machines for analysis. We had an IBM tabulator, which was the state-of-the-art machine at that time.
I remember those.
Big enough to take up practically a whole room that we had for that particular machine. We were very proud of it. Anyway, so I think Bob saw me as being up to date when it came to technology. Turns out I wasn't entirely, but in any case, I arrived at Stanford with my husband and one little girl who was almost 3 at the time that we arrived here. Our little boy arrived in that first year that we were here. When I came into the department, I couldn't help being somewhat awed. There were people there who were already people of considerable stature nationally in psychology. Psychology itself was a fairly new field at that time, and in some universities still hadn't split off from philosophy, but it had for quite a period of time at Stanford. And developmental psychology had its roots there in the work of Terman that is not the provost Terman, but his father, I guess, who had developed the American form of the Stanford Binet intelligence test. That's what we were known for more than anything else. But Bob Sears was nationally prominent because he had just finished his term as the youngest president of the American Psychological Association. And Ernest Hilgard was also very well known in the field. He had written an important textbook.
And Hilgard was here at Stanford.
Farnsworth was here, not as famous, but certainly very well regarded. I'll think of some other people in a moment. If I remember, I was trying to think whether I was the only woman present at that first faculty meeting. It seems to me that Edith Dowley was there, and she was the director of the nursery school, which was being used for our research purposes. That was before Bing Nursery School had been built. And so the work was being done over in some Quonset huts, I believe, where returned veterans who came back to Stanford to school were housed. It's strange that that should still be happening in 1958, but it was. My office was established over in Owen House, which was where Bob Sears had organized his laboratory of human development. In those days, the psychology department was, I'll have to say, ill-housed. Its headquarters, its main office, were in Cubberley Auditorium, in Cubberley Hall, which was the education building, of course. But most of the senior professors had their own little bailiwicks. They would have a house somewhere out around the main campus, and Bob's was Owen House, and Hilgard's was what, I forget. And I know that the few people doing animal work had their own laboratories away from the psychology building. We did do quite a bit of our teaching in the psychology building, however. Now, that first year that my husband and I were here, we were supposedly here just on a one-year sabbatical from our Boston jobs. We were working with Sears and Wilbur Schramm, who was a specialist in communication. And it's curious that he should have been, because he had a terrible speech defect. Maybe that's the reason he went into communication, who knows. But the two of them were running a joint program, and we came to help them on that. And it was only after we got here that we got our offers to join the faculty. We hadn't realized that they had invited us to look us over, but that became clear fairly soon. Bob got me started teaching in the psych department immediately, because as it turned out, Lois Stoltz, who'd been teaching the child development class, the big one, initial first level for undergraduates, had just retired. And so her spot was open, and I began to teach her course.
For continuity, let me interrupt and ask you what your husband's position was. Was he a psychologist too?
Yes, Mac is and was, I should say, a psychologist. We both got our PhDs in psychology at the University of Michigan.
All right, so that tells us a little bit about how she ended up there. And then I wanted to highlight a little bit about what it was like for her as a woman being on a psychology faculty, and also being a member of the faculty at Stanford, being one of the few women there, and what she was asked to do as a result of that. So here's a little excerpt of that interview about her work beyond just her departmental research work.
We didn't go into that I expected to, and that is my role in the university outside the department.
You're right, I did not. Do you have the time to do
Yeah,
that
I do.
now? Go ahead. I haven't turned it off.
Yes. All right. When you get tenure, when you got tenure as a woman in those days, that put you in a rare enough category, and the university was getting very sensitive about the fact that it didn't have very many women in tenured positions. They overutilized us, shall I say. I got a little bit of notoriety around the campus because I was the first person, as far as I know, the first woman to teach in slacks rather than in a dress or a skirt.
That's an intriguing one to be first in.
Yes, my statement of something or other. But they began to appoint me to university committees. I was appointed to the committee on assessment, I remember, because I knew something about test taking and test making. I was on a committee to deal with the people who had been accused of, the faculty members who had been accused of sexual harassment, mostly with their graduate students or with some younger faculty member. That was, to me, an absolutely fascinating thing.
To learn about your fellow faculty members.
Yes, and the thing that struck me was that the men who were accused were absolutely unable to believe that their advances had been unwelcome. And they had a kind of quality of ego that was remarkable to see in action. I was also on a committee to look over the salaries of lecturers. Many departments had come to use lecturers. I think this was maybe more often true in the humanities than in the sciences. What were you saying?
Frequently in the language department.
Yes, in the language department, but other humanities departments too, the freshman English courses and so on. And these people were abysmally treated, really. And also, there were women who had appointments as research professors, let's say, or big-time research associates, who had fully the kind of publication record that the regular faculty had, but simply weren't being considered for faculty appointments. Partly it would happen when they were the wife of somebody who was a prominent person in a field. And they were getting passed over for faculty appointments who were absolutely well qualified and already sometimes had been functioning in the role of teaching in the department. So there was a committee that was set up to try to rectify these things. I think one of the main locuses of that kind of problem was in the med school. And we handed over to a wonderful med school committee of women, of whom Dodie Goldstein was one, to see to it that these differences were ironed out. And we succeeded in getting promotions for deserving women at the time. This I found to be a very rewarding activity, I must say.
One of the contributions that Eleanor Maccoby is known for is a book that she wrote with Carol Jacklin in 1974 called The Psychology of Sex Differences, which was one of the first comprehensive reviews of what we knew in psychology at that time were the differences between males and females. And in this book, they focused on boys and girls, really. It was on development. She had noted that this research literature either portrayed women as having lesser traits compared to men or ignored them altogether. So that was one of the things that she noticed, is that, up until this time that they wrote this book, is that there really just isn't much attention paid to gender differences. And if there are any differences, it's usually the woman that has the lesser of whatever that trait is. That few studies were ever replicated that looked at gender, and few studies could be published if the research found a lack of differences. So this book reviewed the existing literature on development and found that most perceived gender differences were in fact myths. Some of these included that girls were more sociable and suggestible, that boys were more analytical, girls had lower self-esteem. These and other beliefs that people had about boys and girls just weren't holding up when they looked at the literature. Where Maccoby and Jacklin did find some differences, some evidence up until 1974, was that girls generally did better on verbal ability, the boys were doing better at maths, that boys had better visual spatial acuity, and that boys were more aggressive. So those are the only 4 big differences that they found that they could find in that review of the literature. In this oral history that they did with Eleanor Maccoby, she does discuss this book a bit and how it came about. So this is a discussion of the book with Carol Jacklin.
Since you've been at Stanford, what do you think have been your greatest contributions to the field?
I don't think my contributions to the field have been so enormous, to tell you the truth.
And why are you so well known?
I'm overrated.
How nice.
Well, part of it is accidental in the sense that a young woman walked into my office and she wanted a postdoc. She'd been trained at Brown by somebody I knew, and so I had agreed to see her. This was Carol Jacklin. And she and I began to chat about things that we had recently read, and we both were kind of outraged about some of the claims that were being made about sex differences. Women were from Venus and men were from Mars. Actually, that book came out after she and I started working together. She came in the late 60s, just a new PhD with a baby. And we started talking about who had found this and who had found that. And we said, wasn't it time for us to begin putting together a compendium to see if we could add up all the research we could lay our hands on and find out what it really added up to. Now, I had actually started this kind of thing before Carol came into my office because I'd been part of a social science research council work group on that subject.
On the subject
of sex differences and how well established they are and that kind of thing. So I'd already put out one little book of readings on that and was primed to go ahead when she brought this up. And I just had one question for her, which is, suppose we find something that we don't like. Women turn out to have a certain weakness that has been confirmed or something. What would you think we should do with that? Because I said this because I had been challenged by another member of our department, whom I will not name, that if anybody found out anything that was detrimental to the interests of women, they should not publish it. And I had a very strong contrary opinion. And so what Carol said was, well, the truth shall make us free. And I said, okay, you're the one for me. And we started working on that book, The Psychology of Sex Differences.
But she wasn't with the department officially.
No, she came in as a postdoc, and she didn't have any other kind of an appointment except my postdoc. And we jointly raised the money to do the work and hire research assistants and whatnot. So that was a big enterprise. It took quite a long while. We delved through the existing literature, and we found a real problem with the so-called file drawer problem, which is you do a study, you test for sex differences, there aren't any, so you put that part, that computer run or finding into a file drawer. Nobody ever knows that you didn't replicate what somebody else had claimed to be true. So we did, I know we couldn't have been thorough about this, but we tried hard. We would look at the literature, we would know that somebody could have made a test for sex differences in this particular thing, and it wasn't reported. We call them up and find out, did you test for it? Yes, we did, but we didn't find it, so we didn't publish it. Because the journal editors didn't want to publish non-replication. So we found out a lot of instances of non-replication. I remember one particular thing that was so striking. There was one report that on this little test called the prisoner's dilemma, the prisoner, if he confesses, he's going to implicate his partner in crime. If he and his partner both remain silent, they can be safe. But if one of them speaks up and tells the truth in order not to go to jail, his partner will go to jail. So it's that kind of thing. Will you sell out your partner in order to save your own skin? And the first report was women would do that more readily than men would. We found something like 28 replications that did not find that and that hadn't been published. Isn't that weird?
That's very weird, yes.
And so our book came out mainly as a mythbuster. It was a big seller, I have to say, even though it was dense. And the last third of the book is all descriptions of studies, these little abstracts that form the foundation of the conclusions we came to, which were that the only things that were really substantiated was that men were more aggressive, boys too, and that women were not passive. They were astonishingly similar intellectually.
That concludes my excerpts from that Eleanor Maccoby interview. And again, I urge you, if you're interested in following up more about this fascinating person, go and find the links online at the Stanford University Library. Well, we've been talking about women in psychology, and you can see some of the battles and issues that Maccoby had to face, even in more recent decades. As I said, though, another thing that's very woefully sad about this course and the history of psychology generally is the lack of ethnicity in psychology. And by that I mean the lack of diversity, ethnic diversity in psychology. And part of this problem is the fact that probably most of the psychology actually was dominated by white males for most of the time that psychology's been around. I will point out, though, there's been some scholarship in the history of psychology on the role of ethnic minorities at these different points in time. And I wanted to highlight some of these just so you can kind of get a flavor of what else is going on in the history of psychology. So this is actually just a quick review of some contributions of people in American psychology who came from white backgrounds. And just to point out some, for instance, in 1920, we have Francis Sumner, who was the first African-American to earn a PhD in psychology. In 1933, we have Inez Prosser, who was the first African-American woman to earn a doctoral degree in psychology. It was a doctor in education from the University of Cincinnati. In 1943, you have Robert Chin, the first Asian American to be awarded a PhD in psychology. Then we have 1951, Efrain Sanchez Hidalgo was the first Puerto Rican to receive a doctorate in psychology. In 1962, Martha Burnell was the first Mexican-American woman awarded a PhD in psychology. In 1969, we have Kenneth Clark becoming the first African-American president of the American Psychological Association. And in 1999, you have Kenneth Suen becomes the first Asian American president of the American Psychological Association. I list all their names here, and they're what makes them particularly noteworthy in terms of the history here. Note how so much of this happens post World War II. So most of what happened in terms of increasing the diversity of psychology comes from the events that followed after World War II, at least in the United States. And this course has been largely focused on what happened prior to World War II. We've talked in the last couple of weeks about some of these developments that happened since. But I have to just say that we don't have a good representation, I think, of other minorities, minority groups in psychology because of the fact that so much of it didn't really occur until more recent years. And I think that a fuller history of psychology will start to account for these contributions of these people in coming years. I will leave it at that, and just to mention that there are some other sort of dates and facts here just to kind of keep in mind about how woefully unrepresented ethnic minorities have been in psychology. From 1920 to 1966, the top 25 doctoral training programs in psychology in the United States produced 10,000 doctorates in psychology. So there was 10,000 people who received them, but only 93 of those 10,000 were awarded to African Americans. In the 1960s, you did get a rise of African American psychology. You get the Association of Black Psychologists formed then, and there's a Black Student Psychological Association that was also formed in the 1960s. In the 1968 APA convention in San Francisco, there was a good representation of Black psychology at last at the American Psychological Association. There was a conference in 1969 in which George Albee, who was a famous community psychologist, presided and talked about some of these issues of African American psychology. And in the 1969 APA convention, it was in Washington, D.C., Robert Greene was the president of the Association of Black Psychologists, and that was the year that Kenneth Clark was elected president of the APA. Probably the biggest impact of psychology on race and ethnicity issues in the U.S. has been on the issues of testing. It's something that's probably, again, dominated much of the conversation when you've looked at the role of how race or ethnicity takes a place in psychology. It's been largely about debates about whether or not tests are adequate and whether tests are racially biased. There's also been research over the years on differences between ethnic groups, and that the majority often gets represented as possessing the better qualities or the stronger qualities on whatever it is that they're testing. So the same sorts of debates or same sort of controversies that happened with gender differences, in which often, if there were any differences found, men were shown to have had the stronger or the better characteristic on whatever that trait was. The same thing's been true for these kinds of tests when it came to ethnic differences, and often the white majority would be shown to have had the higher score on intelligence or whatever it happened to be. And that has also meant that there was relatively very little research done on relatively disadvantaged groups until you got more people who came from such groups into psychology. And again, all this is focused on the United States. I can't really speak to very much about the history of how race and ethnicity has played a role in other countries very well. Even in Australia, There's a little bit here and there, but I don't think we have a good comprehensive history yet about race and ethnicity issues in Australia. In fact, if you look around the world, this is an interesting map that kind of shows the ethnic fractionalization, basically sort of like how ethnically diverse are different countries. And if you put United States sort of like in the middle in the gray there, then the bluish colors are more ethnically homogeneous, and the red or orange colors are more ethnically heterogeneous. And one of the points that I want to bring up here is that as psychology gets passed around the world and it starts to crop up in different countries, I think that the role of these issues about ethnicity are going to take place and be more prominent in countries where you have more ethnic diversity. It seems that in places that are relatively ethnically homogenous, you don't see a lot of attention to issues of race or ethnicity, probably because it doesn't come up as much. And I think that's an unfortunate aspect. I also just say, by the way, before I leave this topic, that there are some recent histories of psychology that are edited volumes that focus on the history of psychology in different countries. And you could then look at those and find out more, for instance, about the development of history in China or in South America or in other countries that we haven't talked about in this course. I said at the very beginning that I'd be focusing mainly on the experience of European and North American psychology and how that kind of fit in with Australia, but that by no means should be the end of it. We should be more capable of considering other countries' histories as well. And I would just say, hopefully, that you've got enough of an interest in this course that if there is some particular country that you're interested in learning more about the history of it, that you start to consult some of those sources, because I think it's something we're going to see growing in coming years as psychology becomes more and more common and popular at universities in other parts of the world. All right, one more issue, or a couple more issues to bring up here, and this is a distinction that some people have made in the history of psychology of modernism versus postmodernism. I would say that most of the psychology that I've talked about in the 20th century really falls under the modernism label. And this is this belief, this general sort of cultural belief that improvement in the human condition can come about only by understanding abstract universal principles that govern the the universality of humans. So the idea here is that universal principles can be found if we do psychology, and it doesn't really matter where you're doing the research or who it was or what time it was, that the modernist kind of perspective on psychology, at least, has been that universal principles can be obtained from studying people no matter where they are. So this is sort of suggests that you don't have to worry too much about how heterogeneous or how representative your sample is. And also say another hallmark of modernism has been logical positivism. It's maybe sometimes considered a dirty term these days, but logical positivism, the way that I represented it in a couple lectures ago, has been sort of the dominant 20th century approach than the last 100 years. And that, again, really kind of tells us about modernism. What happened after modernism, though, is there's also been this movement called postmodernism that happened maybe near the end of the 20th century, that's kind of maybe come into the 21st century. And the idea here in postmodernism is that it's opposed to the search for abstract universal laws or principles that guide behavior. Instead, this kind of approach to psychology says we can only understand psychology in the context of the culture, the group, or the person with which it occurs. This is trying to say that we probably are overreaching when we talk about these universals. Like when you take a course in social psychology and you learn about attitudes or conformity or social identity, that these perhaps really just apply to the population that was studied there, which would maybe been educated students at universities in largely Western civilizations. So Kenneth Gergen, for instance, has been a prominent writer in this postmodernist movement. And he believes that you should be thinking much more about the culture, the context, and even the time period, and you shouldn't assume that a lot of these things that we're studying are so universal. He says that this is actually a positive thing, that postmodernism is an opportunity, he says, to live aggressively, more tolerantly, and even more creatively with others in the world. And I say here, is there any downside to this? And I guess the argument that has been pushed back against Kenneth Gergen is saying, well, can we really have a science of psychology then if it's all just so transitory? It just depends on the culture, depends on the group, depends on the time and the context. It makes it sound like there isn't any laws or anything, point of learning about these things in a universal way. Other trends in contemporary psychology that I just want to end our course on is to talk about just the accelerated study of the brain psychology connection. I have here Dartmouth as an example. Dartmouth was one of the first colleges to get its own fMRI scanners in its building. They put it on the ground floor or in the basement. And one of the things they did is to kind of get everybody going and interested in neuroscience in the late 90s and the early 2000s was to allow all of the students to have a budget where they could run an experiment in the fMRI scanner. You also see in the contemporary trend in the last 20 years is the return of evolutionary thinking, and evolutionary psychology is becoming quite prominent. I say here, see University of Texas as an example of a place where you have a very strong evolutionary psychology program these days. And I would even say at the University of Queensland, we see a rise in this. We have new methods of research due to the computers and the internet that we wouldn't have anticipated maybe 25, 30 years ago. This has a lot to do with the fact that we can now do a lot of our studies on the web. You can use, for instance, the implicit association test, which has got a website where you can direct people and you can take an IAT. But there's also things like Prolific or MTurk, where we can collect data from people all over the world who happen to go on one of these websites and complete our experiments. And so this has actually opened up a lot of new opportunities for us to have larger sample sizes that are more diverse. Another thing I'll just point to is just the increased professionalization of psychology that's happened, particularly among psychological practitioners. Remember that back in the 40s, we had the Boulder model, which said that all of these clinical practitioners should be trained in the scientist practitioner model, where they kind of get both science and practice. Well, in the 70s, you have this Vail model coming about from a conference in Vail, Colorado, in which it argued that we needed many more psychology practitioners, especially in clinical psychology, and it was too slow of a process to kind of go through these PhDs and have everybody who's going to do clinical psychology also do a major research component. So in the Vail model, there was this new doctorate in psychology that came about in the United States that was largely a professional degree that kind of focused much more on the skills that would be needed to become a good therapist, and minimizing the research contribution. You still have to do a thesis of some sort, but it's not this major contribution to the literature or a major research training that the PhD had. And this was meant to accelerate and make it easier for us to have more psychologists get trained. This model, the Vail model, then was carried over into other countries. And for instance, here in Australia, we have a doctorate in psychology now that doesn't require a PhD. And it's meant to be, again, sort of an easier, not easier, I should say, like a less restrictive training to facilitate practitioners. They're going to go out there and not necessarily want to do any research. And then you have like places like in Australia also having this development of master's programs where you get masters in organizational or masters in clinical versus getting a PhD in org or clinical. And in countries like Australia, having a master's degree is considered an advanced professional degree that you can then go out without having to go on and get a PhD. And that's becoming more and more common around the world. I also want to mention the major organizations we have out there, societies that psychologists belong to. One that's been common for many weeks now that I've talked about in this course is the American Psychological Association, which is actually one of the largest professional organizations in the world. There's only one or two that are bigger than the American Psychological Association. It currently has over 121,000 members. So this organization that was started by G. Stanley Hall back at Clark University in 1890 is still around, and it's still bigger than ever. And it's quite prominent. It does things like dictate the style of our publications. It has some of the most prestigious journals in psychology are published by the American Psychological Association. And in the United States, the APA has become a major lobbying organization to have influence over what the regulations are, what the laws are about the practice of psychology in the United States. There have been also many divisions of the APA formed over the years. So these divisions are meant to be sort of more topical divisions of the American Psychological Association that have voting aspects of the overall structure. But you can see here we have many different kinds of divisions, like the Society for the Teaching of Psychology, that's Division 2. Division 8 is the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. Division 16, School Psychology, and so on. In fact, there are 56 divisions of the APA. About 54 of them are currently active. And when you join the APA, you can actually join one of those divisions. In Australia, we have the Australian Psychological Society that has currently 24,000 members. And here was a recent shot of their website. The functions of the APS are conducted through the national office in Melbourne, it says on their website, with a staff of over 110 people. And they have 40 APS branches spread across Australia, 9 APS colleges representing specialty areas like clinical neuropsychology, clinical psychology, community psychology, and so on, and 41 interest groups that represent the wide range of special interests of the APA's membership. I think the interest groups are sort of analogous to those divisions of the APA. There is another APS out there, and that APS is the Association for Psychological Science, and this is meant to be more international organization, although it originally began in the United States. It has an interesting history that in 1988, a group of psychologists that were members of the APA were this group were largely academics or research-focused psychologists, and they felt that the APA was too much focused on guild issues, focused on things like licensure and whether or not clinical psychologists should have the right to prescribe medicine. And as a result, these researchers felt that the organization, the APA, wasn't really representing research in psychology very well. So they broke off. They formed their own society called the APS. It was originally called the American Psychological Society, and then they renamed their society to keep the initials, Association for Psychological Science, and then are pitching it now to be more of an international organization that publishes top-tier journals like the journal Psychological Science. I'm a member of the APS, and I think it's actually has a good representation internationally. It still has a tendency to focus on issues of American psychologists would have, like, again, things that are going on in Washington, D.C. and laws and so on. But, I find it a useful organization. It helps me with a lot of sort of the science of psychology. Now, the final aspects that I wanted to bring up here is what's been known as the increased fragmentation of psychology. And this is the idea that what's been happening as psychology gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and you got all these people getting trained in psychology, that it's just breaking up into smaller and smaller bits. Janet Spence, who became one of the leaders of the APS that broke away from the APA in 1988, wrote, "In my worst nightmares, I foresee a decimation of institutional psychology as we know it. Human experimental psychologists go happily to departments of biology and neuroscience. Industrial organizational psychologists are snapped by business schools, and psychopathologists find their home in medical schools." And it's an interesting point that she's bringing up here. I think it's had some, what is this now, over 30 years ago that she made this comment. And I think in those 30 years, we have actually seen much more breaking up of psychology into these different sub-schools and subspecialties. I have here, are you concerned about this? And it's just something to think about. Like, do you think it's important for us to stay unified as one department, one kind of psychology, or is it just a natural evolution as psychology becomes more and more specific about different topics that we would see it break up and have lots of different people going off into different parts of the university? Well, for those of you who have been in the course the entire semester and were there at the first lecture, I thought I'd go back and just revisit something that we talked about at the first lecture. And this was the quiz that I gave you at the first lecture. So I asked all the students in this class to answer some quiz questions about their knowledge about the history of psychology. And I thought we could go back now and see where we are with all that. So you remember one of the questions, the first question was, why do clinical and counseling psychologists call their patients clients as opposed to psychiatrists who call them patients? Well, I hope you know the answer to that question now. It's Carl Rogers, who due to his quarrels with the medical profession, started talking about the client instead of the patient, and as client-centered therapy. So we can thank Carl Rogers for the fact that we do this. Number 2 on the quiz was, who's considered the father of experimental psychology and when did he give birth to it? And I hope that by now you remember that it's Wilhelm Wundt, and that we talk about this in December of 1879 because he had his lab and he self-identified as a psychologist. And there he was in Leipzig, and he starts the first psychology journal and the first person to study consciousness experimentally. Number 3, when was the first PhD in psychology awarded to a woman? Let's think back to that one, and the answer is Margaret Floyd Washburn. Remember, she got her PhD at 1894 with Titchener, and she was the only woman at the rank of the University of Cincinnati before joining Vassar. And she never married. She became the president of the APA in 1922 and became a member of the National Academy of Sciences in 1931. When did clinical psychology begin as a profession? And technically, the answer to that goes back to Leitner Whitmer, who talked about it in 1907. He had gotten his degree with Wundt back in Leipzig, and then started this clinic in which he was helping basically children who had different kinds of learning disorders, and called that the psychology clinic. Number 5, we had the question, what do you know about Skinner? And I would have to say that by this point you must know a lot about Skinner, things like his air crib and how he raised his daughter Deborah in that crib. Number 6, who was Don McElwain? Now, I am going to record one more lecture for this course, and this last lecture is not going to be a lecture that's accessible. That is, I'm not going to ask about it on the final exam. It's going to be a freestanding lecture on the history of UQ psychology, and the reason why I ask about who Don McElwain is, he was our first head of school at the University of Queensland back in 1955, and there he is. Number 7, when was the first PhD in psychology awarded in Australia, and which uni was it at? I believe that the first university to grant a PhD in psychology was the University of Sydney, and this would have been in the late 40s. I don't have a clear answer to this question at the moment. I've been digging around for this one for a while, but I know that the first PhDs in Australia weren't granted until the late 1940s. So it would have been somewhere in the late 1940s that we got our first PhD from Australia. Number 8, for what work did Pavlov receive a Nobel Prize? And you remember that in his laboratory, he was studying the digestive tract, and there were all these things we talked about, and he won his Nobel Prize for physiology or medicine in 1904 for that work on the digestive tract. What is Gestalt psychology? Big question, big answer, lots of things. We talked about these gestalts, for example, and these elements of perceptual consciousness in Gestalten. And then number 10, the last question was, besides textbooks, what books have you read written by a psychologist? Well, now you've got 4 more books you can add to this answer, because we've covered William James and The Briefer Course. We talked about Dora, A Case of Hysteria by Sigmund Freud. You've read Skinner's Walden 2, and now finally you've read Cordelia Fine and Delusions of Gender. So that's all I have for this lecture. I look forward to talking to any of you who've seen this lecture or any of the lectures that I've posted up on YouTube. If you ever want to reach me, you can contact me here. I will forever be on Twitter at Social Neuro, and I have a lab page there. And you can also contact me by email by finding me there at the University of Queensland. So I hope that you'll stay in touch long after this course is over and long after you've seen the last lecture. It's been a pleasure telling you about the history of psychology.